Aaron Fruchtman is a lecturer in music history at California State University, Long Beach. He earned his doctorate in musicology from UC Riverside. His research examines film scores of Jewish-themed films and their composers' social and cultural world in Hollywood's golden age. And his talk today is Sonic Symbolism and the Shofar in Hollywood Film Scores.
Thank you so much to the committee for putting this together. I greatly appreciate this. At the conclusion of the nativity scene in William Wyler's Ben Hur, a young shepherd who remains outside the stable while the three magi visit Mary and the baby Jesus turns to Bethlehem and sounds two long blasts on a shofar. The first call turns the heads of the onlookers, while the second burst sounds as the camera cuts to the Christmas star, glistening above the manger. The shofar blasts signal the birth of Jesus. The shofar is not notated in the composer Miklos Rozsa's score, as it is source music, not underscore. Cow, not a shofar. The shofar, usually, but not invariably, a ram's horn, has figured prominently in Jewish narratives since biblical times. The ritual instrument is now most familiar to Jews for its liturgical use in synagogue, specifically when the horn is played approximately 100 times on Rosh Hashanah and at the conclusion of Yom Kippur. As Marcia Bryan Edelman observes, only the shofar with a signaling rather than a musical function retains its unique role in Jewish ritual. After the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, musical instruments were banned, but the shofar remained a crucial sonority for the world of Judaism, serving a ritual function in the synagogue during the high holidays, but also possessing numerous other roles, including communal announcements, alarms, celebrations, and lamentations. The instrument's most noted non-cultic use was as a battle trumpet. In the book of Joshua, the Israelites sought to capture Jericho from the Canaanites. However, the Jewish army was unprepared to scale the walls, and so God commanded Joshua to have his priests circle the city 7 times while sounding shofars. Quote from Joshua, "And when a long blast is sounded on the horn, as soon as you hear that sound of the horn, all the people shall give a mighty shout. Thereupon the city wall will collapse." Joshua 6:5. The blast, accompanied by the voices of the Israelites, shattered the enemy's fortification. This remarkable acoustic event adds a numinous quality to the shofar's sonority that some 20th and 21st century composers have drawn upon for varying dramatic goals. A few Hollywood composers have used the shofar in their film scores. Due to the narrative content and stereotypical shofar blasts occurring in the scores to biblical epics of the post-war era, such as the Ten Commandments, the Story of Ruth, and the aforementioned Ben Hur, composed by Elmer Bernstein, Franz Waxman, and Miklos Rozsa, with this last one. These films share stories derived from the Bible and gain some sort of musical, quote-unquote, authenticity, or perhaps as composers usually of that time would call it, local color, by including conspicuous evocations of the shofar as a biblical instrument. As with Ben Hur, the shofar is used exclusively as a source sound in Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, in which Joshua sounds a shofar to alert Moses and the Israelites to the imminent approach of Pharaoh and his army.
We're trapped against the sea. Caleb, warn the north tents. Joshua.
It is blasted again later in the film to signal Moses' furious return from Mount Sinai after he discovers the Israelites worshiping the golden calf. Mostly we can learn if we want to ruin a party, just bring a shofar. None of Bernstein's own themes are based on shofar calls, not even the militaristic one associated with Joshua. Franz Waxman, on the other hand, infuses his score to the Story of Ruth with both statements of the shofar and brass imitations of the ritual instruments. Let's take a brief moment to describe the traditional shofar calls. The melodic formulae of these calls are not set in stone, and there are copious variations between particular synagogues and shofar blowers, of course. However, despite these discrepancies between communities, certain consistent characteristics, such as tekiah being a longish call, shevarim being 3 shortish calls, and teruah being a quavering call, seem to transcend all other differences between Jewish community, which says quite a lot considering the old Jewish expression, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Now, returning to Waxman's Ruth score, the film begins with the prophet cue. This starts with the forte statement of the main theme. This is a forceful tune opening with a unison ascending perfect fifth in the brass, which could be interpreted as a recalling of the tekiah, a long call. More explicit, though, in nature is the shevarim, the 3 short notes call stated by a trumpet directly before the narrator's introduction. We'll hold our fingers here. No, we won't. Okay, it was worth a try.
Yonder is a city whose name will one day be known in the far places of the earth.
This trumpet foreshadows an actual shevarim, 3 short notes called by a shofar in the upcoming main titles. And in case we weren't clear, let's just put a shofar in our main titles itself. So unlike the shofar blasts in Ben Hur and the 10 Commandments, Waxman's use of the instrument does not have a signaling function, but rather uses sonority as signifier, musical symbolism. Here, the shofar acts as an instrument of Jewish remembrance, a musical emblem of Old Testament Judaism, as it is entirely associated with Jewish characters and dramatically spiritual moments in the film. The ram's horn is thus a crucial part of Waxman's remarkable score. Less conventional appearances of the instrument occur in the film scores of Jerry Goldsmith, the Academy Award-winning composer known for his modernist techniques and avant-garde orchestrational choices. He used the shofar outside of the more traditional biblical narratives, incorporating it into the science fiction films such as Franklin Schaeffer's Planet of the Apes and Robert Wise's Star Trek: The Motion Picture. The use of the shofar is intriguing, especially in the Planet of the Apes, given that the film does not contain any biblical narrative and does not have any Jewish characters. The closest we get to a Jewish character in the film is the Episcopalian Charlton Heston, the same lead actor who we just saw playing Moses in the 10 Commandments 12 years earlier, and who now portrays Astronaut Taylor on this alien planet. Nevertheless, the shofar performs a key role introducing the militaristic primates in the cue, the hunt, that we'll be listening to in just a moment. At the first medium close-up shot of a guerrilla soldier, the shofar sounds for the first time as the hunting of humans begins. Here we'll find my transcription of the sketch. The Ape shofar motive is an 8th note G that leads up to a D before returning to the original pitch. The Ape motive is related closely to 2 traditional shofar calls, the tekiah and the shevarim. Here is that cue. 35 years after composing his score, Goldsmith reflected on the shofar in that cue, The Hunt. Quoting Goldsmith, "When we first see the shot of the horse and the rider turns toward us, and we see that he is a simian, the music has this organic feel, which is a ram's horn, actually, which has 2 notes on it, but they're effective. I think the idea is that we're dealing with a strange race in an upside-down world," end quote. And yes, this is a photograph of Jerry Goldsmith conducting the orchestra at Fox for this recording. Goldsmith's reminiscence is not particularly revealing. Yes, the ram's horn sounds organic. However, it's also, and he's mentioned this in other interviews, often thought of as archaic or primal. This cue is casting a sort of sophisticated musical characterization of primitivism, like that of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, with extreme dissonances, frenetic rhythms, and timbral oddities, paralleling the scene's chaos. The ram's horn complements these musical characteristics by adding, as what Goldsmith says, a primal sound with possible symbolic meanings. Contemporary audiences certainly understood the film's not so subtle storyline of a white human prisoner in a black simian world, and the accompanying interspecies injustices as a thinly veiled metaphor for African Americans living in 1960s America. What separated Goldsmith from his colleagues was his distinctive timbral palettes. He was not as focused on melody as his Hollywood contemporary John Williams. Instead, Goldsmith made a name for himself for fashioning innovative approaches to texture and sound. Along with the shofar, Goldsmith applies the distinctive colors of stainless steel mixing bowls, a bass slide whistle, and brass instruments played with inverted mouthpieces throughout the score to Planet of the Apes. The archaic battle connotation of the shofar appears again in another guise in Goldsmith's famous score for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Here, Goldsmith links the antagonist Klingons with a light motif reminiscent of a shofar call. Dissimilar from the modernist score, which he composed for Planet of the Apes, with Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Goldsmith followed the lead of John Williams in his genre-defining space opera, Star Wars. He created a score that is gloriously tonal and romantic with apparent influences of Strauss, Wagner, and von Williams. In the opening scene, the antagonist theme is stated in the cue Klingon battle. This theme is not performed by a shofar, but by brass and woodwinds. However, the melodic profile is reminiscent of both the ram's horn motive, but also from the hunt that we've just heard a moment ago, that Shevarim shofar call. The theme opens with an upwardly leaping fifth, which is repeated 4 times before Goldsmith continues this motive in a descending sequence. This developmental process accentuates aspects of the melody's primitivism, but the angular nature of the whole step sequence creates a more melodically interesting figure than anything that a shofar can actually produce. Goldsmith discussed his approach to depicting the Klingon, stating, quote, "The Klingon thing was instinctual. I knew there was a barbaric quality about them, a primitive quality, and they were aggressors. I did want to get that into the music, and that was the sum of the intellectual rationalization. I guess they were the bad guys, and they were attacking, so I figured we needed a battle cry for them." End quote. Before any of our Trekker fans in the audience have any umbrage with my statement about them being antagonists, I realize there's a little bit more complexity to Klingons, but we see that's not the case of how Goldsmith's thinking about them. Okay. Despite Goldsmith's unambiguous statement minimizing his intellectual rationalization, there are several reasons to believe that he was explicitly imitating shofar calls. First, and most obvious, the theme recalls Goldsmith's own shofar motive from The Hunt, which was played on an actual ram's horn. Second, the theme is remarkably similar melodically to the Shevarim shofar call. Third, of course, we've already kind of mentioned this in Beckerman's keynote speech from Sunday, there's a long history of Jewish composers imitating shofar calls with traditional orchestral instruments. These allusions or explicit imitations appear in the works of Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, and Leo Zeitlin. Due to the shofar's tonal instability, these composers and others often chose to approximate the instrument's timbre with French horns using a brass mute. Lastly, and I think most persuasively, is the Klingon theme's appearance with an altered instrumentation in Star Trek V, The Final Frontier.
Kirk just got lower shields. Lowering shields, sir.
So in this sequel, Goldsmith accompanies his now iconic Klingon theme in the cue without help with 2 blasts from an actual shofar, as if confirming the presumption that the theme has always had this sort of musical or symbolic association. Goldsmith identifies the shofar with primitivism in his scores to Planet of the Apes and the 2 Star Trek films. His musical treatment of Klingons and gorillas are closely related to, as they both serve as archetypal antagonists. Goldsmith's use of the shofar signifies primitive war and reminds the knowledgeable audience member of the instrument's role as a battle trumpet. The shofar makes brief yet significant appearances in 2 slightly more recent films. In the thoroughly predictable action film End of Days from 1999, former police detective Jericho Kane, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, battles Satan himself to protect. I'm assuming there are too many people in the room who have seen this wonderful movie. Battles Satan himself to protect a young woman from being impregnated and bearing the Antichrist. In the main title cue, composer John Debney delivers a spiritual aura, complete with requisite boy soprano chanting in Latin and an orchestral quotation of the Dies Irae. Amid the cacophony of boy soloist, choir, synthesizers, orchestra, church bells, clanging percussion, and a heavily reverberating shofar blast is sounded in one single note. The addition of this ram's horn might be construed as a mere sound effect, but the composer's usage here is an attempt to add a layer of symbolic meaning to the film. By connecting the ancient Jewish battle instrument to the film's opening cue, the shofar foreshadows the spiritual battle between good and evil that concludes this movie. Regarding his choice of instrumentation, John Debney remarked, here I quote, "There are sound environments and textural diversity that come from instruments of ancient times to the futuristic colors of electronics," end quote. The primal and archaic sonority conjured by the shofar attracted both Debney and Goldsmith, yet the ram's horn's Jewish connotations go unmentioned by both of the composers. Instead, they simply mention the musical signifier of antiquity. The shofar plays a slightly more notable role in Edward Shearmur's score to Ian Softly's thriller, The Skeleton Key from 2005. The film opens with Caroline, played by Kate Hudson, a young caregiver being hired to look after Ben, an immobilized stroke victim. In an early scene where Caroline discovers Ben missing from his bed, a frantic search begins. During her pursuit, Caroline becomes cognizant of supernatural forces at work in Ben's plantation house. At the moment of this realization, a shofar sounds with 2 consecutive long tones above a pounding rhythmic pattern.
His door was locked.
The shofar softly appears again when Caroline stumbles on an old vinyl record titled Papa Justifies Conjure of Sacrifice. The album contains New Orleans hoodoo rituals. Therefore, again, the shofar signifies primitive religion or ancient rituals, and thus no specific Jewish connotation in Shearmur's score. Additionally, Shearmur is linking the shofar's supernatural role in the Battle of Jericho to the otherworldly phenomena occurring in the skeleton key. The intermittent practice of sounding shofars in these film scores makes for an intriguing study of the use to which sonorities are used to suggest a plethora of different associations in the listener. Rarely do Hollywood film composers overtly display their Jewishness outside of Jewish topic films, such as Exodus or The Chosen. Therefore, it is of particular interest when a Jewish ritual instrument sounds in a Hollywood film. Most early examples of the shofar film are straightforward attempts to add quote-unquote authenticity to the soundscape of a biblical film. However, some composers, such as Franz Waxman, use the shofar quite specifically in order to represent Jewish remembrance and spirituality, while the non-cultic examples, as exemplified in the scores of Jerry Goldsmith, recall the shofar's roots as a battle trumpet. In contrast, the more recent scores by John Debney and Edward Shearmur connect the shofar to the blanket concept of perhaps world music and a non-specific conjuration of generalized ritual. These last two examples, paradoxically, rely on a contemporary audience's unfamiliarity with the ancient instrument, which creates a sort of sonic curiosity. It's worth noting that Shearmur and Debney are the only composers mentioned in this study who are not Jewish, and their use of the shofar does not allude to its traditional function whatsoever. Instead, the sonority of the ram's horn is used by these composers to intone long-held notes for coloristic effects, unlike Goldsmith and Waxman, who creates melodic material based on shofar calls. This discrepancy might imply an insider's knowledge of Jewish music or simply a compositional choice for a specific score. With these last several examples by Goldsmith, Shearmur, and Debney, the shofar has been associated with negative contexts, including human oppressing apes, warlike Klingons, and the eternal battle between good and evil, and witchcraft. Aside from the shofar's use in post-war biblical epics, there is a pattern of its use in relation to pejorative connotations. However, even with the instrument's technical limitations, there is not a universal consistency of the use of the shofar in Hollywood film scores. In differing narrative contexts, the shofar is included in a score for source signaling or to symbolize biblical times. Jewishness itself, a general religioso feeling, paranormal activity, primitive instincts, or perhaps even just overt militarism. Thank you so much.